5473 on 36 left, clear takeoff.
Good morning, Singapore 324, flight level 430.
471 distance level 260 2000, 500 feet per minute or more.
32 Lima Charlie, how do you read?
We all read you 5.
Herzlich willkommen zu einer weiteren Folge von Read You 5 Second Set, Teil des Podcast-Projekts der VC und der GDF. Bei Second Set geht es ja darum, ein kleineres Detail aus unserer Arbeit herauszupicken und zu beleuchten. Für diese Folge hatte ich mir einen Überblick über die Arten der EASA-Regularien vorgenommen. Als Vorstand Fachliches der GDF stellt dies einen wichtigen Teil meiner Arbeit dar, der sich direkt auf die Arbeit von Piloten und Lotsen auswirkt. Um hier ganz genaue und korrekte Informationen zu vermitteln, habe ich mir ausnahmsweise Verstärkung geholt, weshalb ich gleich auf Englisch wechseln werde. Aber wie ich schon mal gesagt habe, wir haben ja alle English Level 4. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Let me introduce to you Fabio Grasso. Welcome, Fabio.
Hi, have a nice afternoon.
You too. What should our listeners know about you, and what makes you so well suited to talk about EASA regulations?
Okay, once again, hi everyone. My name is Fabio Grasso. I am Italian national. I joined EASA in 2010, initially as an ATM and as expert. And for many years, my main assignment were related to the development of rules or regulatory framework in the ATM ANS domain. Specifically, I was involved in the areas of ATCO licensing and training, human factors requirements for air traffic services providers, and also standardized rules of the air, where I contributed to the team which developed and maintained the rule until they are so far. And in particular, I was in charge of developing the regulatory package for the EU air traffic services requirements introduced in 2020. Since 2018, I am in charge of the EASA section titled ATM Standards and Development, whose main activities are the further development and maintenance of the EU regulatory framework on ATM, the execution of the oversight activities purpose to verify the implementation of the framework throughout the EU member states, and the compliance with the EU regulatory framework, and also the activities related to support implementations for stakeholders, like, for instance, authorities or industry, for an harmonized implementation of the rule. I think that all of this makes me a bit suitable for replying to the questions that and the subject you want to talk to me today.
Yes, they very well do. Thank you very much. That's why you're here with me. What have you been doing in your former life before you came to Cologne, to EASA?
Well, I had a very interesting life as in 1989, many years ago. I started my ab initio training to become an air traffic controller within the Italian Air Force, which I achieved at the end of that year. And since the beginning of 1990, I started working as an ATCO, qualified over the years in the various available ratings such Tower Approach, GCA, and also area control. For 16 years, I have worked in several, ATS units, and I was also extensively, involved specifically in the last part of my military career in operations planning and airspace management. I would say that I still remember that part of my professional, personal life as a kind of paradise. I enjoy so much being an air traffic controller in operations. Unfortunately, or luckily, I don't know, I still have to understand. In 2005, I moved away from the operational context and I joined Eurocontrol as a civil military expert, and I worked for Eurocontrol for almost 6 years, focusing primarily on airspace management, information management, and aerodrome operations from the civil military perspective. And then in 2010, as I said earlier, I decided to join EASA, where I'm still actively serving.
Well, that's quite a career. Thanks, Fabio. So you are working on EASA regulations, covering all aspects of aviation. Did you work on any regulation that affected both ATCOs and pilots the same?
Yes, indeed. And as I mentioned already earlier, I was involved in the development and the maintenance of the standardized European rules of the air, SERA, which of course addresses not only air traffic services, but also pilots and other actors. And then, of course, as I said, also the air traffic services requirements, of which I'm very proud of. I think that they are primarily addressing the ATS providers or the air traffic controllers or flight information service officers, but indeed they are of extreme relevance also for pilots.
So you mentioned already kind of different levels of regulation, like, for example, SERA and the ETCO rules. What kind of levels do you really mean by that? And what does it really mean for us end users?
Okay, here the talk starts being a bit more technical, maybe a bit even legalistic. So I apologize with the listeners and the people which are connected to this podcast if I'm getting a bit cryptic in certain part of my language. I will try to simplify as much as I can. Okay, so EASA is developing rules on the basis of a regulatory mandate, which is established in a council regulation, which is the so-called EASA basic regulation. There are a variety of regulatory documents and acts which may be produced by EASA for the purposes and for meet the objectives in the basic regulation. The most important one probably is the activity which leads to the delivery of proposals to the European Commission for implementing or delegated acts, in a nutshell, of regulation, which is normally done by a document which is named an opinion submitted, as I say, to the European Commission. Then, once such proposals are delivered by EASA, by a process which maybe I can explain you further if you wish, the proposal is further scrutinized and discussed between the Commission and the EU member states, so that if there is a final agreement, the text with eventual modification is finally adopted and becomes a new regulation. EU regulation, which I want to underline already from now, as we are going to mention them probably more than once, are of a binding nature for all the regulated party within the European states, and also for the other states which by agreement will decide or have decided to apply them.
And that would be maybe Switzerland and Norway and
no, because like these states are not EU states, but are already part of the EASA system. I think we are talking about Switzerland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and the fourth one is Iceland. So EASA produces proposals for binding rules to the Commission, and then of course proposals for their maintenance, if there is a need to maintain them over the years. But of course, EASA produces also supporting material for the implementation of the binding rules which are in the so-called EU regulation. And we are talking about acceptable means of compliance, otherwise known with the acronym AMC, which are normally more detailed and technical provision whose application ensures that a principle stipulated in a binding rule is met, meaning that if you apply that AMC related to that specific implementing rule, you are sure that you are meeting the objective of the binding provision. And guidance material is also produced, which does not constitute a requirement, but provides an explicit explanation of the intent of the content of a binding rule or even of an AMC when it is so required. So meaning the GM does not constitute any regulatory obligation or means of compliance, but is a way to provide additional detail on the intent of a rule or a specific terms or of a procedure which has been described in an AMC. EASA is also responsible for the issuance of certification specification, which are detailed technical provisions used for the certification by the competent authorities of a specified aeronautical product, part, appliance, and as well as for airdromes. Normally, AMC, GM, and certification specification are issued with a different act compared to the proposal for a new regulation or an amendment to an existing regulation, which is published with the opinion. Here we are talking about the issuance of an ED decision, EASA ED decision, for which consultation with the European Commission is not necessary. Everything, the process is executed and completed within the EASA.
You mentioned the competent authority, and I think the listeners might need some help in who is a competent authority. So for pilots, would that in Germany be the LBA, and for ETCOs be the BUF?
I think so. The competent authority is the competent by the regulation is that entity which has been designated by the state to fulfill certain tasks which are normally certification and oversight of the rules. And normally in our rules, we have a part which is related to the organization and technical requirements, which is for the service providers, for instance, or the training organization, when we are talking about ATCO licensing, in charge of qualifying the air traffic controllers or providing the services. We have a set of technical organizational requirements. We also have requirements for the competent authorities, meaning that once the state has designated the competent authority for a specific regulation, then the competent authority has to execute its tasks according to the requirements established for them in the relevant rules.
Perfect, thank you. And you've been mentioning already like the different levels you have and how they kind of link together. But I think it would be great to have an example. Can you think of a good example that applies maybe to pilots and ETCOs that shows the implementation rule and how it goes down from there?
Well, I think probably the easiest part is to refer to SERA and to the communication procedures. The standardized rules of the air, of course, there is a requirement for the pilots to establish a continuous communication with air traffic services, and at implementing rule level, so the requirement is of a binding nature, to always use in the communication between pilot and air traffic controller a standardized phraseology, unless in the cases when such phraseology do not serve the intended purposes, and then plain language may or is to be used. This is a general requirement, is binding for controllers and for, let's say, pilots. But then we have to establish what are these phraseologies to be used. And when building up this regulatory framework, it was decided that the standard phrases to be used for this dialogue, which are derived from those in ICAO PANS ATM, would be better placed at the level of AMC. And therefore, the phrases, the technical phrases, are established at AMC level. Further down, we have some guidance material, which, for instance, explains how the drafting and what the various symbols and the taxonomy of the phraseologies is to be intended, because there are different meanings depending on the symbols when you will read the phraseology on the regulatory material. To clarify specific aspects in the use of the phraseology, for instance, that when a controller issues a communication to all stations, there is no need for all stations to reply to the call, but just to listen. So you see that the regulatory package addressing the communication and the phraseology has been built in different layers based on the intended purpose of the rule. There are also some considerations to be taken into account when we build up a regulatory framework like this, or rules and the related acceptable means of compliance and guidance material, is that we have to also understand the possibility to amend the rules by a quick process rather than by the long process of having everything at implementing rule, and also the flexibility to be provided in general. I'm not talking about the phraseology with regard to the local applications.
So what you're saying is you have the overall SERA rule, which says you have to use standardized phraseology. Yes. And then below you've got the AMC, which includes a huge list. Yes. Maybe some listeners have already looked at it, with all the phrases that are prescribed. And if they are there, you have to use them.
Yes. And
then you've got the GMs that say, for example, when there's something in brackets and in square brackets, and how this is supposed to be handled. Is that, have I understood that correctly?
Yes, indeed. Especially on the latter, I would say that this GM, one of the GMs that are associated to this requirement, is really explaining how to read the phraseology that you see in this appendix containing the various phrases which have been established at the level of this AMC. You have different symbols to be used, and then you may understand what is mandatory to be included or what is optional, what needs to be used in certain circumstances.
I've looked through SERA, and that's not the only thing you've produced. You've produced loads and loads of documents, a huge set of regulations. Where do they really come from? Does EASA just make them up?
First of all, let me emphasize that before any other consideration, the paramount objective of the rules that we develop in EASA is to achieve and maintain a high level of safety in aviation operations, because then there are many other objectives, even those described in the basic regulation itself, which are not safety, but safety is our paramount. Everything else is accommodated in terms of perspective and objectives once we are making sure that an appropriate level of safety is guaranteed. EASA develops normally its rules on the basis of a well-defined rulemaking procedure, which is established by its governance body. Maybe you want to know how the regulatory plan of EASA is established, right? This may be also interesting for our listeners. So before undertaking any regulatory activity, EASA, in cooperation with its stakeholders, and in particular EASA advisory bodies, analyze a potential issue for regulation, then concurrently determines the objectives and the various options available in case action is determined as necessary. And then at the same time establishes the related priority and the timeframes for undertaking the selected action. It is important that when an issue has been identified, which require action from EASA, it is not necessarily a regulatory action, but the previous assessment may result in the need to undertake research, to undertake safety promotion, or even request the member state to undertake certain actions without going for rulemaking. Or it may also be a combination. Normally, when rulemaking activities are considered necessary, EASA undertakes them via the so-called rulemaking task. In the development of a rulemaking task, EASA is often supported by stakeholders in the development of the provisions that are being proposed. The stakeholders' involvement has always been and is still being considered extremely important, because it allows EASA to take into account the different views and interests, as well as to take benefit from external expertise, in certain cases, expertise from different perspectives and experiences. Once the rulemaking group or EASA in isolation have a mature version of a draft proposal, there is always the moment where EASA submits the proposal for consultation. The consultation may be targeted to the public audience, meaning that it is published on the EASA website, and each and every organization, stakeholders, individual citizen from Europe and even outside of Europe is entitled to submit their comments to the various aspects of the documents which are being consulted. Or the other means by which the consultation may be undertaken is the consultation of the early mentioned EASA advisory bodies. Once the consultation is closed, either from the public or from, let's say, the advisory bodies, EASA is normally working very hard to analyze each and every comment received, to which it is committed to provide responses, and of course to further process the regulatory proposals versus the feedback that has been received from the stakeholders. In this phase, there is also the possibility, and in certain cases the need, for EASA to further engage with stakeholders, not the ones which have supported with the drafting, or maybe some of them in the rulemaking group supporting the rulemaking task, but even building up a specific focus consultation activities depending on the subject that needs to be discussed. At the end of this process, EASA normally gets to a conclusion and reaches the point where, in the case of a new or an amended implementing regulation needs to be issued, publishes an opinion, as I said earlier, to the European Commission, or publishes directly an ED decision issuing new or amended IMC, GM, or certification specification. I know maybe this explanation is a bit procedural and too much technical, but I hope that I managed to give a flavor of the fact that EASA undertakes regulatory activities based on well-established processes or based on well-identified needs. We never do it in isolation. We always engage with stakeholders, consult with the people, and do our best to take into account the various perspectives from the stakeholders, but at the same time safeguard safety.
Let's go back to the previous example we had. That was phraseology. So many years ago, EASA thought we need to harmonize phraseology on a regulatory basis. So they formed a task and a group, and the group looked at some sources. I'm guessing here ICAO, and then they submitted this to the stakeholders, which could comment on the phraseology. Is that how I understood it correctly?
Yes, it is exactly like this. But in fact, the phraseology has a special story because I think that the phraseology was first established with the initial SERA regulatory package years ago. And the phraseology was kind of derived directly from PANS ATM. Of course, the PANS ATM phraseology were subject to a complete revision to verify their suitability to the European context. We are not talking about standards in case of those phraseologies, so there is a level of flexibility for their application to other member states under the ICAO context. And therefore, we wanted to make sure that the final result was indeed an agreed standard phraseology throughout all the European states to have a real harmonization on the phrases to be used in the communication, to avoid misunderstandings which may result from different application of the phraseology from a state to another. But then a couple of years ago, EASA has undertook a further initiative to revise the phraseology, in particular with regard to the inclusion or better definition of those phraseologies to be used for the provision of flight information service and aerodrome flight information service. So we went through a detailed analysis of the existing phraseologies versus the regulatory framework for FIS being introduced with Regulation 2020-469. And then we came up with updated phraseologies, which were not dramatically changing, but better clarifying those phrases to be used, especially in the context of FIS and AFIS. And at the same time, it also gave us the opportunity to introduce the indication whether each and every phrase would be applicable in the context of the air traffic control, in the context of the flight information service, or in both contexts.
If there is a difference between ICAO provisions and EASA regulations, for example, in phraseology, what would that be, both from a practical or even from a regulatory point of view?
Let me build a bit, okay, on this, because it's important to set up the background for to answer this question, okay? The EU member states are all ICAO members. This means that they would be obliged, inter alia, to transpose the ICAO provisions into their national legal system, because the ICAO provisions, although part of the international law, are not applicable directly in a state. The EU states do not have to go for this transposition because for most of the ICAO annexes and main documents, this transposition has already been made under the EU law. You know, Part ATS is built on Annex 11 and PANS ATM. SERA is built on Annex 11 and Annex 2. Part MET is building on Annex 3, and so on and so forth. So the EU member states don't have to do it because this is already done by the EU on their behalf. And the EU regulations, not the MCNGM, are directly binding to the member states and to all the regulated parties within the member states. So now you are asking me who takes the primacy. Normally, when we develop the EU rules on the services for which ICAO has also produced standard and recommended practices, also because there is a clear objective that the EU rules developed under the basic regulation have to facilitate the implementation or facilitate the member states fulfilling their obligations under the Chicago Convention, we have performed a very extensive and thorough transposition of the ICAO provisions into the EU rules. With the previous situation, before such exercise was undertaken, the member states were still in the position to submit differences towards the ICAO framework. And this was generating a kind of uncoordinated implementation of many ICAO provisions throughout the European Union. This has been removed by the transposition, meaning that member states are obliged to apply the EU rules, which are based on the ICAO SARPs. There might be some differences, but only when the differences have been through the regulatory process, the complete regulatory process, considered appropriate and necessary to suit the European operational needs. But in this case, EASA is producing documents which are called EFOD compliance checklists for each ICAO annex, which are indicating the compliance or the non-compliance for each of the standards for transposed into the European rules. This is done to facilitate the member states in understanding where there are differences, but also in submitting to ICAO the differences in application to certain standards when such standards do not fully align with the EU regulation, which the member states have to apply.
So you said there are these ICAO rules and states could deviate. And now we've got the SERA rules. Nobody can deviate from that. And is there a possibility to deviate from lower level regulation like the AMCs?
First of all, let me say that under the basic regulation, there is the possibility also to deviate from binding rule, but only following a very specified process for exemptions and for specified typologies and on a temporary basis. This is possible, but the related process needs to be applied. Now, back to your question more on the flexibility provided at the level of the AMC. Yes, as I said, applying AMC is a presumption of compliance with the related binding rule. You may also, as a state, decide to allow the use of an alternative means of compliance, meaning a different process or procedure or whatever application, which, in the view of the competent authority of a member state, is not following an existing AMC, but is applying a different process, which ensures anyway that the objective of the corresponding binding rule is met. In this case, there is a process to be established at national level, normally between the competent authority and the organization proposing the alternative means of compliance. There must be an evaluation at state level, and then the evaluation is communicated to EASA, and EASA has to assess whether this alternative means of compliance is really suitable as declared, because otherwise the competent authority would not submit it to EASA, if it's really compliant with the objective of the binding rule to which it corresponds. EASA is not entitled to reject, does not even approve the alternative means of compliance, but expresses its views. And in case the view is divergent from that of the competent authority submitting, then the dialogue continues in the context of the standardization inspection, where EASA goes on site and verifies the application of the alternative means of compliance, like they do with the application of the regulatory framework as such, to ascertain whether the safety objectives in the regulation have been met.
What were your most recent activities that we might experience soon ourselves, or what's in store in the near future?
I am managing a quite, numerous team, dealing with a variety of processes and a wide scope as well, because ATM NS seems a very short acronym, but you know better than me that it covers so many different domains within it. Most of them are completely interrelated. Some others work more in isolation, but everything is under this scope in EASA, and we want to ensure that the work is done thoroughly, coordinated, not only within the ATM-NS team, but also with the other domains. I'm thinking about ops, I'm thinking about flight crew licensing, I'm thinking about airdromes, developments in ICAO, and so on and so forth. So it's really quite a piece of work to manage all the activities of the team, and I'm extremely satisfied about the contribution of my team for the timely and efficient execution of the tasks under our responsibility. There are a few initiatives I wanted to mention here, which maybe are of interest of this audience. One probably is of interest for the entire ATM community, not directly linked or evidently linked to operations, but we are really very much and deeply involved and engaged and intensively engaged, given the time frames and our deadlines, to complete the complex work to introduce a new regulatory framework for the conformity assessment of ATM-ANS equipments, which shall replace the previous regulatory framework for interoperability. It will offer additional possibilities, ensuring this conformity assessment, but at the same time also to ensure continuity with the previous one. So it's really very challenging, and is I would say we are using a lot of resources for that, also given the time pressure. Probably it's also interesting for the audience to know, but I'm sure that some in fact already knows that EASA is also very much engaged to ensure that the ATCO licensing scheme will evolve efficiently, safely, to accommodate the future ATS provision or the future ATM scenario in general described by the ATM master plan. And something which is already ongoing, I would say more easy and quick to reach, is the ongoing regulatory process to amend the standardized rules of the air, SERA, for which a consultation process was undertaken during the summer this year. And now we are in the process to finalize the related opinion to the Commission. And this will introduce finally some amendments to the SERA rules, which are waiting for quite some time, in particular those to align with the evolving ICAO framework on the subject.
I think quite a few are waiting for the SERA update. Thank you very much, Fabio. That was a very, very detailed talk about the EASA regulations. You were a perfect guest for that. I hope we meet again soon, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thorsten, thank you very much for having offered the opportunity to provide a bit more information about the EASA world from the EASA perspective to this audience, which in the end, I believe represents one of the core communities for which we are working every day. And I apologize if in certain cases I was maybe a bit too much technical and I would say procedural in my explanation. Is part of my profession. I lost a bit my operational dimension and approach from the old times when I was a controller, but now I'm playing a different role. And of course, EASA remains available to pilot and controller community to provide any additional information, any additional explanation about the work that we do. And we are extremely happy that you wanted to engage us to offer this opportunity to communicate with the people on the field. Thank you very much again, and hope to see you soon.
Bye, Fabio.
Bye.